Hey Amarillo, I'm Jason Boyett, and you're listening to Hey Amarillo, the interview podcast featuring some of the most interesting people and stories of Amarillo, Texas. Today's guest is Holly Ridings, and Holly is one of those guests I've been chasing for several years. She is an Amarillo native who is the director of the Exploration Operations Office at NASA. And she explains exactly what that means in our conversation. Holly and I went to high school together. She graduated from Tascosa in 1992. We were in a lot of classes with each other. She was a high achiever even back then. And so it was no surprise to me that she ended up at NASA, nor that she ended up in 2018 becoming NASA's first female chief flight director. So she has spent thousands of hours in mission control. She's led a number of teams supporting the International Space Station. Holly's a big part of NASA's current Artemis campaign and ultimate goal of sending humans to Mars. Well, her family still lives here in Amarillo. And when she was here to visit them early this spring, Holly and I had the chance to sit down together and talk about her career and the role that Amarillo played in it. So here's Holly Ridings. Holly Ridings, welcome to the Hey Amarillo podcast. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, I am super excited. I've wanted to do this for a long time, so I'm glad it finally worked out.
I'm glad it worked too. We've been talking about trying to do this for years, so I'm glad we finally got the opportunity to do it. Our schedules aligned, and we've known each other since we were in school together, a lot of classes together, but I want to start with you the same way I start with all my guests and just ask how you ended up in Amarillo to start with.
Okay, how did I end up in Amarillo? My family has been actually in Amarillo for generations. If you go way back in history, came across the U.S. in a covered wagon to Texas. This is about the 1850s, and then headed on up to the Panhandle. So history of my family, blacksmith.
Okay. And
so came up to Amarillo looking for work after stopping a couple other places.
Wow.
And owned blacksmith shop. Like my great-grandfather. Up until 40s or so, then he did some, kind of art type things. So blacksmith shop, Amarillo dairy.
Okay.
So my family's been here a long, long time. So I was born and raised here, and my parents and one of my sisters still live here.
Okay. You where'd you go to school?
I went to Tascosa High School.
Okay.
Before that, Crockett, and before that, Olson Park.
Okay. So we were in school together at Tascosa,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of classes. Did you have a sense of what you wanted to do at that age in Tascosa? You were a high achiever in school. I know that. But did you have a goal at that point?
Yeah, so origin story, right? Origin story question.
Let's talk about it.
Because I work at NASA, I get a lot of that question. And so my answer is yes. So I really first thought about working in the space industry when I was in the 6th grade.
Okay.
So I'm 12 years old. And, I figure out my age, but 6th grade.
I think I know where you're going.
Was the Challenger explosion.
Yeah.
Because we're the same age. And so Olson Park, and actually I walked by there not long ago with my son. They used to roll those TVs into the cafeteria. So you sit in little chairs and those, big boxy TVs on the stands, and they'd roll them in. And for all kinds of interesting, news events, it'd line you up and you'd sit and you'd watch. And so I watched the Challenger explosion live. In the 6th grade, sitting in the cafeteria in Olson Park.
I was at Paramount Terrace, had a very similar experience.
Yeah, and it's interesting, core memories, right? Did right that second I think, wow, I'm going to have this big job at NASA? Well, no, but it was impactful to me. And, you don't know what happened. The teachers are really upset. You realize later, the entire crew has lost their lives. And for me, I wanted to figure out how to help that situation, how to make it better. So how do you keep people alive when they're launching on rockets? Well, you major in engineering.
Okay.
So I decided pretty quickly after that I wanted to major in engineering. And then I went to space camp, got a job, went to space camp, sort of checked out the space thing, really loved it. And then, went on up after Tascosa. I went to Texas A&M, majored in mechanical engineering. And then had to figure out, how to break into the space industry. So I knew that I wanted to, work in space, help keep the crews safe, and be an engineer at a really early age, which is really lucky. I talk to so many people who don't really know what they want to do, and some people change what they want to do as they go along. So I'm one of those people that Early on,
You
I
had
had
a
a
plan.
goal. I had a plan. This is what we're doing, and it's worked out pretty
Was
well.
A&M a strategic choice? Like, is there a pipeline to NASA through those kinds of engineering programs?
Yeah, so maybe not as much as other places in the country.
Okay.
Again, when you're young like that, mostly you just think I want to be an astronaut, and I ended up not being an astronaut.
Did you
But
want to, though? Like, was that something you thought about?
Again, NASA was represented by astronauts,
Okay.
so absolutely, I'm gonna go work for NASA. I'm gonna be an astronaut. I'd still love to go to space, so don't get me wrong, but I very much was focused on trying to find a good engineering school. I'm the oldest of three, so I'm also really practical. State school and scholarships, and I was lucky enough to have some of that happen for me, coming out of high school. So it wasn't so much all of the NASA people come from Texas A&M. It was really I needed a good engineering school that was, kind of fit with within what we could do.
Before we talk about getting into NASA, I'd like to hear a little bit, and you and I have had this conversation in the past about the groundwork for that education that came from Amarillo. Because I think a lot of people sometimes are, especially when you end up in a position of authority, like they're surprised to hear that you went to public schools in a relatively small town in the Texas Panhandle. Because I'm sure you encounter people that are private schools, pathway to Harvard and stuff like that in your work. And sometimes that feels like a different kind of story. Is that accurate?
Yeah, when I talk about my background, every single time I talk about it, the sentence that comes out of my mouth is, I'm from a small town in Texas. Now you could debate whether Amarillo is really small. It's not by some standards.
But it's not Houston.
But it's not Houston. And why do I say that? Because that is a foundational contextual thing that gives people insight into, me as a person and what I've accomplished. And, if you had to boil it down into just one thing, a lot of it's work ethic. So if you are a person who has a lot of, opportunity and exposure, that obviously teaches you a lot. And I actually did, even growing up here, had amazing teachers. I went to space camp, got a job, went to space camp twice, actually. Through some contacts that my dad had, was able to, meet one of the astronauts. So, there are still resources in Amarillo, maybe not as obvious as if you live in Houston and, the astronaut lives next door to you. So I was able, through, the encouragement of a lot of, mentors and a lot of my family, access those resources and make those connections, along with, growing up. Flying in space is a team sport. And, growing up in Amarillo it's a team community kind of place. So between, the work ethic that I said at the beginning and that sense of community, that's kind of, when I say I'm from a small town in Texas, that's what I mean.
Okay. Tell me about then your path from A&M to NASA.
Okay.
I mean, you don't have to give me the full resume or anything like that, but tell me what that looks like.
Yeah, so I went to Texas A&M. I majored in mechanical engineering. This is, 1992 is when I started. So the reason that's important is about that time frame, the International Space Station, which today exists on orbit and has been flying, with people on it continuously for 20 plus years, that almost didn't survive. There was a lot of discussion in the space community, and not really that I, of course, was involved in. I was really young, about whether that was what we should do as a country. Should we prioritize building a space station? It ended up surviving by a very thin margin at the congressional level. And so the reason that's important is when I started college, I wasn't sure how hard it was going to be to get into space. And so people ask me, well, why aren't you an aerospace engineer? Well, because I needed some options. And mechanical is kind of a big, wide. I said earlier, I'm practical. So I started off not knowing for sure what was going to be available in space. And so majored in mechanical engineering. I actually worked at a nuclear power plant just to, get some hands-on practical experience, as one of my summers. Trying to make sure I really wanted to do that and make sure it was really available. And then when I was close to the end of school, I had an opportunity to go up to the Goddard Space Flight Center. So on the East Coast, it's in Greenbelt, Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C. Really, access to NASA headquarters. And it was a summer program I'd had to apply for through the Texas Space Grant. So I mentioned earlier, accessing the resources available, through Texas, through Amarillo. And I got, selected as the student to go from Texas. And then that was really when you could start to see, all of the pieces that were out there.
Okay.
And so I ended up at Goddard for the summer, came back, finished school, and then went down to work at the Johnson Space Center. First, actually, as a contractor, because NASA wasn't hiring.
Okay.
So I worked as a contractor for a little bit, and then got brought on by NASA. So you look back, and it's easy to just say, "Yep, I wanted to work for NASA, and I made it happen." But even just that quick sketch, there was a lot of things that could have not gone right.
Yeah.
And so I think that's kind of how life is. You just make choices, and they work out for you.
So I know that your career there has progressed in some really interesting ways. Can you give me like some of the job titles you've had?
I understand.
People probably won't understand what those mean in a lot of ways, but like I want to see like kind of how you progress at NASA.
Yeah, so I get to NASA. This is 1997, 1998, and I'm a contractor, and I'm mechanical engineering. So I went in to work on thermal systems on the space station. So there is no space station. We haven't launched the first piece of the space station, and so I'm a thermal systems.
It's at the design
flight controller
point, or
the hardware is mostly built.
Okay.
So you can think about, and this is an important distinction. You have to figure out what you want to build, and you have to do contracts. You've got to go build it, and then you operate it. And so for most of my career, I worked in operations. Mm-hmm. So probably a year or two before you fly, the hardware is being built, you would go start to learn it and understand it, and then it flies. And then you sit in mission control and make sure, in this case, the thermal system. So think pumps and valves and fluid and radiators and that type of thing. You make sure it works. I get to NASA, thermal systems flight controller. Did that for many years as we're building the space station. So we call those assembly flights. It's, like you're building a Lego. You launch the first one, and then you launch the second one, and you connect them, and you launch the third one, and you connect one. And we had all these different missions where the crews would launch in the space shuttle and do this building up of the space. It was amazing to watch it just start from nothing. And now you've got this, orbiting laboratory in space. After a few years of doing thermal systems, I applied to be what's called a flight director. So this is, think Apollo 13, Gene Kranz and the white vest. Right. So now instead of just being one of the people who sits in mission control taking care of a spacecraft system, so thermal, power, life support, now I'm in charge of the whole team. And so as a flight director, your job is the safety of the crew first, the vehicle itself, and then the success of whatever mission that you've been charged to do, add a piece to the space station, do spacewalks. And so I did that job as a flight director, for many, many years.
Well, you became the first female flight director in NASA's history.
The first female chief, yes.
Chief flight director.
Yeah, so I was just a flight director for many years.
Okay, so there's different levels of flight director.
Yep, there's different, yeah. And then I got to be like in charge of the flight director.
Got it.
So now I'm the chief. So that was the sort of the next level up. And so I was a flight director for many years. I got to be in charge of some amazing missions, international, joint with the Japanese. Actually, with the SpaceX team, I was the NASA flight director who was responsible for the very first cargo Dragon that ever flew to the space station in 2012. So after doing that, then, you apply. I got selected as the first female chief flight director. So at the time, 12, there had only been 12. So flight directors, there's not very many. It's a very small team. Mm-hmm. And since the very beginning of NASA, everyone has a number. So I'm number 62. And we're up a little bit past 100 right now. So I got to be, the person in charge of one of the, best, smallest, most amazing teams in the world. It was an amazing job. And I did that for 5 years. We flew the very first commercial crew vehicle. So Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley to the space station in a Cargo Dragon. We got ready for the Boeing Starliner, the uncrewed mission. We worked on Artemis 1, the exploration mission, all while I was chief. So best group of people in the entire world.
Did you go into that knowing that you might have the opportunity to be the first woman in that role?
Not
Was that on your
at
mind
all.
at all, or was it just this is what I want to do and I'm going to try to?
Yeah, not at all. When you become a flight director, it's just here's your mission, and here you gotta take this piece of hardware and do these spacewalks and figure it. It's very technical. You're down and in. You're leading teams. As you've been there a while and figure out you really love it, you think, okay, well maybe I would want to run this amazing team. But I even then didn't think, I'm looking around and maybe this will work out and it'll be me and I'll be the first female. I ended up deciding I wanted to do it. And actually after I got selected, people, asked me that question, what's it like to be the first female chief flight director? And for a long time, I really struggled because, if you are in engineering, you show up, you do your job. I mean, any job really, right? You just show up, you do your job. But after a while, you realize that, it's a value. You can be a role model. People need to see themselves. And I have a son. And so, boys need to see it as much as girls. And so after a while, I started maybe more to embrace this unique place that I ended up, right? I thought I would have, that platform or that opportunity. And that kind of came with the job I wanted to do.
I think NASA's probably like a lot of places in the United States, and that it has historically had a gender imbalance, because of the engineering side, for a long time, and STEM is trying to fix that. But like, there were just always more boys than girls moving into those fields. Was that something that you were aware of as you were in college, as you were moving into your career? I mean, because I think I've read somewhere that it's like, I don't know, a third of NASA's workforce is female still. Like, it's not a half and half sort of place.
Different perspectives at different times.
Okay.
So, in mission control in Houston, if you look around on any given day, it is very balanced. It's actually really interesting. But there are pockets of space and not as much human spaceflight. Human spaceflight's done a pretty good job, but there's a lot of other space, satellites and, defense and those kind of things that have less balance for sure. But at NASA, I've had female mentors, I've had male mentors. I never really perceived much of an imbalance, but I have been places where there absolutely is. We've done pretty good. Where you end up with it being challenging is you get sort of, we'll call it mid-career, your mid-30s, and people want to start, having families. Some of that's obviously on the female. And so for me, I started to notice it more after we had our son, just because then you have to make different choices about how you're going to balance that as a family. And so many of the females, I think, are making the choice to stay home with the kids or trying to balance working. And so I became actually more aware of it after we had our son.
Right. Okay. So I want to give listeners an idea just of what your job's like on a daily basis, because all we know is, movies and TV, and we see flight directors smoking cigarettes and barking out orders, in the 60s.
No more cigarettes.
Yeah, I imagine that has changed. But like, what does it look like? I know that, space missions, there are years and years apart and years of planning. And so it's not always just standing in flight control, in front of a bank of computers. So like, what's your day like?
To be fair, right, we left off kind of on the resume with chief flight director, and then I've had 2 other jobs since then.
True.
So my day-to-day right now is maybe a little bit different than my day-to-day was as the chief. But,
okay, so let's talk about what your job is like now. Okay. So what's your current title?
So my current title is the Director of Exploration Operations.
Okay.
So what that means, NASA has a big program called Moon to Mars. And so that's where all of the things that we need to go to the moon, live in this big umbrella. So think rocket, spaceship. So SLS is the rocket, Orion's the spaceship. We've got to have a lunar lander. We're going to have a gateway, space station around the moon. All of that is under a big Moon to Mars umbrella.
The Artemis program is included in that umbrella.
Exactly. And there, we think of Artemis, I think of it as the big umbrella. Some people think of it as just, the crewed mission, like Artemis 2 will fly next year. But everything that needs to happen, for example, you will launch a lander without people in it. It meets up with the people later. So all of that is under this big umbrella. And so my job is the director of operations. So we figure out, what the missions are going to look like, all the priorities on those missions, and how to bring all that together. When you're building that much flight hardware, and making it all work together, some of it's commercially built, some of it's, NASA built, different ways that we have the teams in the country do that for us. It's a big job to figure out what you're going to do with it all. So that's my job as director of operations.
So you come out of an engineering background, which is very hands-on.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine your job now is mostly administrative. Like it's a lot of team leading meetings, that sort of thing. Do you have any tie to that actual let's figure this thing out? Or are you always just directing people to figure things out?
Yeah, one of the great things about NASA and about the jobs I've had. So I had the chief flight director job. You're still sitting in mission control. Then I actually went over to Gateway, which is going to be the space station around the moon, and built hardware for several years because I'd not done that.
Okay.
I had not done that part of the life cycle. And then now operations is you really are still very technical.
Okay.
You get to adjudicate, a lot of, we talk about it in terms of risk. Okay, well, we're going to land on the moon. What is the things that we're going to have done for the first time, at least in our careers, or maybe we're doing differently because the technology is different than it was the first time we went. Okay, what do we do about those things?
Yeah.
And so you get to go and prioritize, and where are we going to put resources, and then actually, make decisions. Okay, should this mission be, X long or Y long, or should we do 3 VAs or 4 VAs? And of course, it's not just me, but we get to do that work every day.
Yeah.
I don't think of it. There is some administrative, but I actually really don't think of it. Last week I was in, San Diego, walking on the Navy ship where we were headed out to do an underway recovery test, which is where you practice, picking the capsule up out of the water and, it floats in the well deck of this big amphibious Navy ship. And those guys are, nice enough to go pick up the crew for us when they land here next year. So I am very lucky in that I still feel like it's a lot of technical work, which is what makes us all very happy as engineers. So
you mentioned next year's Artemis mission. Like, I know you probably don't want to get into like specific dates or anything like that, but like what can you give us an idea of what the next few years potentially could look like because of the stuff that you've been working on, and the last few years of planning and
so
timelines and all that kind of stuff?
We're really excited. So Artemis 2, right? So we flew Artemis 1 the fall 2+ years ago, uncrewed. So the way when you're going to build new space vehicles, typically you'll fly once with no crew in them to test out the systems. We've done that for other vehicles, and so that was our uncrewed mission. This will be our first crewed mission. So we're going to put 4 crew members in the Orion capsule. So Reed, Victor, Christina, and Jeremy. And then they're going to slingshot around the moon, which is amazing. Spring of next year.
Okay.
When you look at what's going on, when you're inside kind of a year, which is where we are for a space mission, I mean, it's like you're going. And so there's a lot of hardware in Florida at the Kennedy Space Center. We're in the process of what's called stacking. So the SLS rocket has a big core stage in the middle. It's orange if you see it on TV, and 2 side boosters, solid rocket boosters that are white. So all of that, just last week we moved the core stage, over and are stacking it all together. So you're into a very significant, hardware flow, assembling, the rocket.
It's all real stuff at this point.
It's all real stuff at this point. Now, there is also a lot of planning in terms of what's the crew going to do on orbit, and we practice that in simulations. That was my job as a flight director and the chief flight director. There is a lot of, when the launch date changes, your trajectory to get to the moon changes slightly, for example. So, there's analysis that goes into it. We do a big process called the certification of flight readiness, where everybody shows up and say, hey, I've done my job. And so we're going through the process of pulling all of that together. So right now, Artemis 2 is, hardware is moving every week. We've done this piece, and the spacecraft, first the rocket and then Orion on top, is starting to come together like visually. So this is the really, really fun part. In parallel with that, the next mission on the books is the moon landing. And so then add into the mix another team, another vehicle. We have 2 contractors, partners that are building landers for us. The first one is SpaceX. And so the lander will be the Starship, and the second one is Blue Origin.
Okay.
And so they have, it's called the MK2. So they are working, extremely hard to bring those online for us because you need them to get down to the surface of the moon. So Artemis 2, spring of next year, 4 crew will go around the moon, not land, and then after that, we add the lander into the team and then get down to the surface. And then the next mission after that, you start adding the space station. So Gateway into the team. And Gateway itself then is a lot of new team members because you have international partners, you have different providers. Northrop Grumman is building one of the modules, Maxar's building a different module. And so that hardware, like the module that the very first Gateway module, like just came, to the U.S. where it's going to get outfitted in Arizona.
Okay.
Like yesterday, day before. So, it's real, it's hardware, it's starting, the pressure cell's all built. So out through the next couple of missions, you can see the hardware and you can, see it starting to come together. So things start around the moon and then the landing, and then we start building up the space station.
Okay. Where did those missions fit into Mars as a goal? Like, those are all like baby steps in order to make that leap, right?
Yeah. So somewhere back in the beginning, I talked about my job, director of operations, and the big umbrella is Moon to Mars. Mm-hmm. So there is a huge component of this whole thing that we haven't talked about yet, which is the science. So we're going to have a lot of science capability out at the Gateway Space Station, down on the surface of the moon. And a lot of that is really kind of, forward looking onto Mars. If you think about flying in low Earth orbit, you can get to and from the low Earth orbit space station 6 hours. Sometimes it takes 24, depending on what day you launch, but 6 hours. You can get out to the moon 6 days. If you go to Mars, the shortest, depending on if all the planets align, and I mean that literally, you're 3 months, and really it's more like 6 or 9. So you are using the moon to figure out how to live and work both on orbit and on the surface in, you think of deep space. Like, you can still get home, but it's hard.
Yeah. Once
you head to Mars, you really are sort of untethered from the Earth in a way that we have not done that before. So, the living and working on the surface, the living and working deep space, the science to understand, what's going on. Even to get to the moon, you got to fly through the radiation belts, through the Van Allen belts, which is different than what we do, for low Earth orbit. So everything that we're doing in the moon part of Moon to Mars is to give us, data and skills and experience to go onto Mars.
So you and I are in our early 50s. Do you think that mission to Mars will happen in your career? I mean, I know you probably don't want to talk like specific timelines and things like that, but like, are we that close?
We're getting closer for sure. It depends on how long we decide to work.
Yeah. That's the other question.
I mean,
65, 75, what do you want?
I mean, I do think, though, there is the opportunity to get it done in our careers for sure. I think that technology-wise, it's coming along. I think experience-wise, it's coming along. I mean, when I started working at NASA, and as a flight director, I got to pick a flight director name.
Oh, yeah?
And my name is actually Viking Flight because my first NASA mentor at the Goddard Space Flight Center was the project scientist for the Viking landers on Mars.
Okay, cool.
In 76 and 77.
Wow.
So there is a part of the NASA DNA, the human spaceflight DNA, that, is and always has been super excited about Mars. And somebody asked me the other day what was I was most excited about. And this is it. Like, if you use my son is 13. So if you use a video game analogy, you get on the video game and you just grind, like it's Minecraft, and you start with like a stick, and then you do 2 sticks, and you make a piece of wood, and then you take a piece of wood and you make a, brick, and on and on and on. And I feel like, human spaceflight, we have just been in that mode, and we are really like this close, to the tipping point. We're going to get the moon going here and just in the next couple of years, and that is going to give us what we need. So my answer is yes. We may have to work, and we can't retire tomorrow.
No, no plans for that.
I mean, I'm super, super excited about it. We're this close to making it happen.
What's your relationship to Amarillo these days?
Oh, so my parents are still here,
okay.
Of course. My sister is here. My nephew was here. Now he went down to Lubbock. So, we are here a lot. My son loves coming. My husband loves coming. So I try to come several times a year. I mean, first of all, Christmases and holidays and, birthdays and all of the things. But to me, Amarillo, I walked into my parents' house yesterday. It's just always home. I'm super lucky that they're still in the house I grew up in.
Yeah.
So it's so foundational. Like my youngest sister has young children and brings them. And so it's really still the center of our family and kind of the foundational hub. And it's been that way our whole lives.
This week's episode is supported by SKP Creative, and the team there asked me to talk about the Amarillo Tribune. If you haven't heard, this is a new local nonprofit journalism project. I'm actually a founding board member. I'm just on the budgeting and nonprofit side. I do not write for them. But Jackie Kingston is the CEO and executive editor, and she has helped make the Tribune over the past year into Amarillo's first community-supported, digital-only news organization. It provides free public service journalism about Amarillo in this area. It's a daily publication. They've got daily emails you can sign up for, and it provides local coverage about issues we care about, including city government. This is an election season, and that stuff is super important right now. And so SKP invites you to support the Tribune with a monthly or one-time gift, but reminds you that content on the Tribune is always free. You can learn more by visiting AmarilloTribune.org. That's AmarilloTribune.org. And thanks to SKP Creative for the support. Okay, I'm back with Holly Ridings. Holly, this is the part of the show I call 8 Straight. I'm going to ask you the same 8 straight questions I ask most of my guests. And I want to start with this one. When you think of Amarillo 10 years from now, what do you hope for?
I hope in some ways that it hasn't changed a lot. I mean, okay. Amarillo has grown, since I lived here in terms of population. But amazingly to me, it still has the same character.
Okay.
Which, you'll hear me get emotional. I think it's amazing. And so I think that, trying to maintain that character, but still modernize in a way, that keeps up with the times. Because my family is really important, I asked them, showed them a few of these questions, and it was like, to just grow, but retain the character.
Grow without changing the core of the personality of the city.
But it's the culture, right? I mean, what do you get out of living in Amarillo? You get, grit, and you learn how to work hard, and, you live in a community that'll take care of each other. I mean, that's all really good. Mm-hmm. We should not lose that.
Other than wind, what does... I had to start asking that
because
everybody would say wind.
Yeah. Oh yeah, so that was all of us.
I introduced that a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Apart from wind, what does this area have too much of?
Okay, can I go with like dust? Or does that count as wind?
It's wind adjacent. But we, as someone who has spent the last 2 weekends cleaning dust off of my patio, windowsills, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I borrowed my parents' car. My dad might have gone out and cleaned the dust, again, before I even drove over here. So, what does it have too much of? This one's a tough one because you just think dust and dirt, and we almost couldn't get past that. I think it's that kind of year.
Yeah, I think so too. You're somebody who has, after going to college, like you stopped living here and you lived, in other places since then. Do you look back? Does that help you gain a little bit different perspective on maybe what we need to have more of, but like also what maybe we don't recognize here and could be holding us back?
I'm such a huge context person. Like, I think it's important to understand what's going on in the world. And, depending on the means you have and where you are, you might not necessarily get to, travel the world and see it all for yourself. But I do think it is just extremely important. One of the things about Amarillo and the growth is it actually now has a tremendous amount of, opportunity to learn about different places, different cultures, different backgrounds. And so I just think, I I probably didn't recognize that as much when I lived here, and certainly didn't take advantage of it in a way that I think you have the opportunity to take advantage of that today. I mean, you just do your magazine, you try to highlight it. I look at that magazine and think, I didn't know that existed in Amarillo. So I really think just more of that mentality of, what I said earlier, trying to maintain the community and the small town culture and the belief, but also then realize where you sit contextually in the world and where you might end up, with a little bit of an echo chamber. And that's true, like, no matter where you are.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Yeah. Okay, what does this area not have enough of?
Not have enough of. I would say direct flights in and out of Amarillo.
Yes.
I mean, that,
I get tired of stopping in Dallas on my way to everywhere else.
Right. I came home and I was like, I could get to New York and back for the day easier than I could get to Amarillo, from Houston. So I do think, again, one of the questions about growing, making sure that Amarillo is wired to the rest of the world in a meaningful, efficient way, whether that's business, whether that's communication, transportation, is going to be important. And so some of that is, industry and facilities. Some of that is that planning of the community and what we need. I think, again, talking with my family, a lot of that's going on, but I think that's important. You want the option to connect and manage that connection. You don't want to not have that connectivity in any form of business and have it not be there when you need it. Okay. So you got to make sure it happens.
What's your favorite Amarillo neighborhood?
Oh, well, my parents live in Olson Park. I grew up in Olson Park, so I have to go with Olson Park. They, literally just live in the house I grew up in. So
Olson Park's a cool neighborhood,
for sure.
Though. I mean, it's still a very cool neighborhood.
I mean,
it's got a lot of
We
prestige.
walk to the park when we're here. Still, it looks very similar to when I went to school. It's this, school I went to. So no, I'm super big fan of Olson Park.
Okay, what's your favorite Amarillo restaurant?
That one's
Where do you guys go eat, like, when you're here?
I mean, we went to Chili's yesterday.
They got Chili's in Houston. So.
I know, right? Jorge's or Taco Villa. I mean, just like if you're our age, like, you just have to say Taco Villa. We sometimes Dyer's, barbecue, fan favorite, absolutely, forever and ever and ever. So that's probably the one I would go with.
Okay, those are good. That's a good list. When you talk to people about growing up in Amarillo, what do you talk about? Like, when they ask, I mean, what was it like there? I mean, what are the things that you end up bringing up?
Yeah, so, I mean, I played sports, when growing up here, and that, that community support, it doesn't exist everywhere. You live in a big city. I do live in a big city, so I live in Houston, and even in a suburb of Houston, you don't have that sense of community. And it's interesting. If I think about my career, we grew up in Amarillo, sense of community, whether it was sports or school or, anything you're involved in, everyone is pretty positive and supports you. Then I went to Texas A&M. It's a huge, community and culture and traditions.
Yeah.
Then I went to NASA, and it's like the same. It's traditions and culture and community. And so I don't know that I would have either A, been drawn to A&M and then NASA, or B, been successful at them without really valuing that community at some core level.
Okay. What's the most underrated aspect of having grown up here?
Yeah, this is a fan favorite question. So seasons. Mm-hmm. My family seasons, absolutely.
Not the same in Houston.
No, it's not. And all of the seasons, so I look at the weather when I'm going to fly in, and, yesterday it was 42 degrees, and then it was 83.
And we got snow in the forecast for this weekend.
That's what I heard, right? And people in Houston think that's bonkers. People almost anywhere think that's bonkers.
It is fairly bonkers, but we love it.
It's kind of awesome. And so, what does that do for you? You can kind of handle anything. Yeah, it's going to snow today. All right. There's a dust storm. Okay. You really get where you can handle anything. When I first, talking about kind of outdoors, and I'm a huge outdoors person. I took this test once, and it said, if you don't go outdoors every day, you'll be kind of crazy. And I think that, so I think that I got that from Amarillo. You can walk outside, you can see the horizon. My dad and I were just talking about that this morning. And so when I first went to school at Texas A&M, if you've ever been down there, hills and trees. Yeah. And I was so confused because I was like, you can't see, and so there is a physical outdoor aspect of seasons and stars and being able to see for miles, that is, so meaningful to me. There's other parts of growing up here. I mean, just, again, we've talked a lot about the community and the culture, but that aspect is formative in some way that I didn't realize until, much, much later.
Okay, cool. You mentioned outside. When was the last time you visited Paladura Canyon?
Probably when we were here Christmas time. And we go almost every time we're here.
Do you? All right.
Actually. A couple years ago, we brought our scout troop, actually, and camped. We brought our RV. And, it was just amazing. But we climb the caves. My son's been, we're big Paladura Canyon fans.
Okay.
So
Good.
Always have been.
All right, that concludes the 8 straight questions. I like to close by asking my guests to endorse something. So what's one thing you would like listeners to know about or to experience?
Man, one is really hard. I was thinking about it. So my background, some of the things I did, you think of Fun Fest at the time and all the things I got out of it, right? I mean, this is not an endorsement, but I started kind of there. So if I had to pick one, that's hard. But I just mentioned actually bringing our scout troop to Paladura Canyon. So one of the things that this community, we grew up going to Camp Don Harrington. Now, this is me like always getting. You're gonna have to cut this part out because then I don't know.
I think it's endearing.
So this is a funny story, and you can leave this in or out. But a couple of years ago, I had to go to A&M and give a talk. And Mike was in Florida for a launch, and my parents were actually meeting me there. And we're in the car, and I said to Matthew, my son, "Hey, what should I talk about?" And he was like, "Well, Mommy, talk about anything you want, but just don't cry." And I was like, "Oh, thanks, honey." And of course, I get up on stage and I was getting an award, and it's all this stuff, and they've done all these amazing things, and I was like,
sure,
So he's like sitting in this room, like he's 10, like trying to crawl under the table. So I tend to be a little bit emotional about things I care about. Anyway, so Scouts. So my son does Scouts, so I know quite a bit about it. My dad was an Eagle, and so to me, like just things like that permeate the community. People it's all volunteer for the most part. They have to raise money, keep everything going. So I would say Scouts.
Okay. That's a good one.
Yep.
Holly, I'm glad we had a chance to do this. Thanks for being on the podcast.
It was awesome. It was so much fun to come do it. I'm glad I got in, and finally managed to do it with you. So thanks for having me.
I appreciate it. And that concludes the episode. So I want to say thanks to Holly for the interview. You'll be hearing a lot of stuff about NASA in the year to come in preparation for the Artemis 2 mission. Thanks to SKP Creative and the Amarillo Tribune for supporting this podcast, and to Angelina Marie for editing every week. And thank you for listening. Hey Amarillo exists on a weekly basis because of listeners like you, including financial supporters and executive producers Patrick Burns, Josh Wood, Jason Burr, Katie Linger, Corey Burns, Cindy Graham, and Barbara and Jim Witten. This has been episode 399. Big milestone episode 400 is coming up next. My name is Jason Boyett, and I'll see you next week.